30 years on television, and Simon Cowell had never stood up for anyone. Not for the most talented singers, not for the most heartbreaking stories, not even for the winners. He sat, he judged, he delivered his verdict. That was his role, and he never broke in character. Until that night. Until an elderly farmer from Nebraska walked onto the America's Got Talent stage and said 7 words that would change everything. The farmer's name was Earl Thompson, and he was 73 years old. Weathered hands that had worked the same land for 5 decades, a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and eyes that carried the weight of a story nobody in that theater could have imagined. When he stepped into the spotlight, the audience fell silent. Not because they were impressed, but because they could sense something different about this man. Something real in a world of performance. Simon looked up from his notes, his usual expression of mild skepticism already forming. He'd seen thousands of contestants, heard every sob story, witnessed every attempt to manipulate emotion. But something in Earl's posture made him pause. The old man wasn't trying to sell anything. He wasn't performing. He was just standing there, holding a microphone like it might break in his hands. But what Simon didn't know was that in the next 3 minutes, this quiet farmer would teach him something about life that 30 years of success had never shown him. Earl cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the silent theater. "I'm not here to sing," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I'm not here to dance or tell jokes or do magic tricks. I'm here because my son entered me in this contest before he died, and I promised him I'd come." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Even the judge's usual chatter stopped. Simon's pen froze mid-sentence. In 3 decades of television, he developed an instinct for emotional manipulation, for contestants who used tragedy as a strategy. But this was different. Earl wasn't asking for sympathy. He was just stating a fact, the way he might mention the weather or the price of corn. "My boy Johnny was 34 when the cancer took him," Earl continued. "Smart kid, always believed in people more than they believed in themselves. He used to say I had stories worth telling, stories that might help folks understand what real strength looks like. I never believed him, but I promised." He paused, looking directly at Simon. "And a promise to your dying son isn't something you break." The camera caught Simon's face in that moment, and for the first time in the show's history, his mask slipped completely. Not the controlled emotion he sometimes allowed for particularly moving performances, but something raw and unguarded. Something human. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Earl reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. "This is a letter my daddy wrote me when I was 18, heading off to Vietnam. Never showed it to anyone, not even my wife of 45 years. But Johnny read it after Daddy died, and he said it needed to be heard." The theater was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Simon found himself leaning forward, his usual detachment completely abandoned. There was something about the way Earl held that letter, like it contained the most precious thing in the world. "My daddy wasn't an educated man," Earl said, unfolding the paper with careful reverence. "Couldn't spell worth a damn, grammar was all wrong. But he understood things about life that took me decades to figure out." He cleared his throat again, and when he began to read, his voice carried across the theater like a prayer. "Earl, my boy," he read slowly, "by the time you read this, you'll be in a place where men do terrible things to each other, and you'll wonder if there's any goodness left in the world. I want you to remember something. The strongest man isn't the one who never falls down. The strongest man is the one who gets back up, helps the man next to him get back up, and then finds a way to make sure others don't have to fall in the first place." Simon's breath caught. In all his years of judging talent, measuring success, defining what made someone worthy of stardom, he'd never heard anything quite like this. It wasn't polished or clever or designed to impress. It was just truth, delivered by a man who'd lived long enough to understand its weight. Earl continued reading. "You're going to see things that break your heart, son. You're going to meet people who've forgotten how to hope. When that happens, don't try to fix them. Just show them that goodness still exists. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes being a good man in a broken world is the bravest thing you can do. Simon stopped the show. No one knew what was happening. Without warning, Simon raised his hand, the universal signal for everything to stop. The music director looked confused. The producers in the booth frantically gestured to keep rolling. But Simon wasn't paying attention to any of them. He was standing up, something that had never happened in the show's history, not for this reason. Earl, Simon said, his voice carrying an authority that commanded complete attention. Stop for a moment. The old farmer looked up, uncertain, clutching the letter like a lifeline. In 30 years of doing this, I've heard every story, every song, every speech designed to move an audience. But what you just shared... He paused, struggling to find words that felt adequate. That isn't entertainment. That's wisdom. The audience held its breath. Simon Cowell, the man famous for crushing dreams with surgical precision, was having a moment of genuine vulnerability on live television. And everyone in that theater knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Simon walked around the judges' table, something that simply wasn't done during auditions. Security looked nervous. Producers whispered frantically into their headsets. But Simon kept walking until he was standing at the edge of the stage, looking up at Earl like a student waiting for a lesson. Tell me about your father, Simon said simply. Not for the cameras, not for the show. Tell me about the man who wrote those words. Earl's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. He was a railroad worker, Mr. Cowell. Never made much money, never traveled farther than the next county over. But every Sunday after church, he'd walk through town and check on the widows, make sure they had enough food, enough coal for winter. Never made a big show of it. Just did what needed doing. But what happened next, no one in the theater, or watching at home, could ever forget. Simon climbed onto the stage. Not dramatically, not for show, but with the quiet determination of someone who just realized something important. He stood next to Earl, two men from completely different worlds, sharing a moment that transcended television. Read the rest, Simon said softly. Earl's hands trembled slightly as he returned to the letter. The world's going to tell you that success means beating other people, being smarter or stronger or richer than them. Don't believe it, son. Real success is measured by how many people are better off because you were here. That's the only score that matters when you're lying in your bed at the end. Simon closed his eyes, and for a moment, 30 years of built-up armor seemed to fall away. When he opened them again, he looked like a different man. How many people have you helped, Earl? He asked. The farmer smiled, the first real smile he'd shown since taking the stage. Well, Johnny used to keep count when he was little. Said I helped Mrs. Henderson with her groceries 847 times before she moved to the nursing home. But I wasn't counting. I was just living the way Daddy taught me. Simon nodded slowly, understanding flooding his face. And your son? What did he do? Became a doctor, Earl said proudly. Pediatric oncology. Spent his life fighting the same disease that eventually took him. Never charged a family that couldn't afford it. Said healing wasn't supposed to be a business. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. On his last day, he told me that everything good he ever did came from that letter, from the lessons Daddy taught us both. The silence in the theater was profound. Not empty silence, but the kind of quiet that comes when people are processing something that changes them. Simon stood there, a man who'd built his career on finding flaws, on separating the worthy from the unworthy, faced with a definition of worth that had nothing to do with talent or ambition or star quality. Earl, Simon said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. What are you really doing here? Because this isn't about a talent show, is it? The old farmer looked out at the audience, then back at Simon. Johnny always said there were two kinds of people in the world, those who lift others up, and those who tear them down. He said you were one of the best at what you do, But maybe you'd forgotten which kind of person you wanted to be. Earl folded the letter carefully, placing it back in his pocket. So no, Mr. Cowell, this isn't about talent. This is about reminding one good man that goodness still matters. Simon felt something break open inside his chest, 30 years of cynicism cracking like ice in spring. He'd spent decades perfecting the art of judgment, of finding what was wrong with people's dreams. But standing next to this farmer, holding a letter from a man who'd understood life better than any success manual ever written, Simon realized he'd been asking the wrong questions. He turned to face the judge's table, then the audience, then the cameras that were broadcasting this moment to millions of viewers around the world. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Ladies and gentlemen, Simon began. In 30 years of judging talent, I thought I knew what made someone special. Tonight, Earl Thompson has taught me something I should have learned long ago. Talent isn't just about what you can do. It's about who you choose to be. He looked back at Earl, this weathered farmer who'd traveled 1,000 miles to honor a promise to his dead son, carrying a letter from his father like a sacred text. Earl, you may not sing or dance, but you've just given the most powerful performance I've ever witnessed. Simon reached for his buzzer, but paused. The golden buzzer was meant for acts that would advance to the live shows, for performers who could win the competition. But what Earl had shared transcended competition. It was bigger than talent, bigger than television, bigger than anything the show had ever seen. Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. You know what? Simon said, a smile breaking across his face for the first time that evening. Some things are more important than rules. He slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer, sending a shower of gold confetti falling from the ceiling as the audience erupted in the longest standing ovation in the show's history. But Simon wasn't done. He took the microphone from Earl's hands and addressed the theater directly. Earl Thompson won't be going to the live shows, because what he's shared with us tonight isn't something you compete with. It's something you carry with you. It's something that reminds you why we're all here in the first place. He handed the microphone back and embraced the farmer, a gesture that felt more like a benediction than a congratulation. As the applause continued to thunder around them, Simon whispered something in Earl's ear that the cameras couldn't capture, but those who knew Simon well could see the impact of whatever words passed between them. Later, after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience filed out, Simon sat alone on the stage where Earl had stood. In his hand, he held a photocopy of the letter that Earl had insisted he take. The original would stay with the farmer, but the words, Simon realized, were meant to be shared. That night marked the beginning of something new for Simon Cowell. Not a personality change or a publicity stunt, but a quiet evolution. He began asking different questions during auditions. Instead of just, "What's your talent?" he started asking, "What's your story?" Instead of focusing solely on star quality, he began looking for character quality. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. But those who worked with him noticed the difference. He became more patient with nervous contestants, more encouraging to those who fell short of perfection, more interested in the human being behind the performance. He still maintained his standards, still delivered honest critiques, but there was something softer in his approach, something that honored the courage it took to stand on that stage and be vulnerable. 6 months later, Simon received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box, and inside that, a single ear of corn from Earl's farm, along with a note. "Mr. Cowell, this corn grew in the same soil where my daddy taught me to plant seeds of kindness. Thought you might like to know that kindness is still growing. Earl Thompson." Simon kept that ear of corn on his desk as a reminder that the most important performances happen not when cameras are rolling, but in the quiet moments when we choose to lift each other up. Earl Thompson had come to America's Got Talent to honor a promise to his son, but he'd left having reminded one of television's most powerful figures that true power lies not in tearing people down, but in helping them remember who they're capable of becoming. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's the greatest talent of all.